In March of 1971, a small weatherboard house in regional Victoria received a letter that should have arrived 18 months earlier. The envelope was creased, water-stained along one edge, the postmark almost unreadable. The address was written in handwriting the woman at the kitchen table recognized instantly, because she had read that handwriting every week for 2 years and then, for 18 months, had not read it at all. She did not open it straight away. She set it on the table and looked at it the way you look at something that might not be real. Her husband had been told formally in October of 1969 that their son would not be coming home. The telegram had arrived on a Tuesday. A duty officer had come to the door on the Thursday to make it official, to use the correct words, to stand in the hallway with his hat in his hands and say sentences that had been said in 10,000 hallways across Australia and had never once gotten easier to hear. Now, 17 months after the funeral, the Postal Service had finally done what military mail in a war zone sometimes failed to do. It had delivered a letter from a man who was already gone. This is the story of that letter. This is the story of the 3 weeks before it was written, the 4 minutes that ended the man who wrote it, and the 50 years his family spent deciding what to do with the last words he ever put on paper. And this is the story of why, of every document produced by the Australian War in Vietnam, that single letter, 1,100 words, written by torchlight, folded twice and pushed into an envelope that took longer to arrive than its author had left to live, says more about the men who served than any official record ever has. To understand why a letter could matter this much, you first have to understand the man who never thought of himself as someone whose words would matter to anyone outside his own family. The property sat on red soil country, the kind that turned to dust in January and to something close to soup in July. 3 hours from the nearest town, with a population over 1,000 and closer, to 5 hours from anywhere with a picture theater. He grew up doing the things rural Australian boys of that generation did without thinking of them as character building, because nobody around him ever used that phrase. He fixed fences before school. He learned to shoot rabbits before he learned long division, and learned both well. He spent his Saturday afternoons either on a horse or under the bonnet of a truck that was older than he was. And by the time he was 14, he could strip an engine down and rebuild it with his father standing nearby doing nothing but watching, occasionally, wordlessly, handing him the next tool before he'd finished asking for it. He was not, by his own family's account, an unusually intense or driven child. He was quiet in the way a lot of country kids were quiet, not shy, exactly, just economical with words. The way you become when the nearest neighbor is 40 minutes away, and conversation is something that happens at dinner, not something that fills every silence. His mother used to say he thought in long sentences and spoke in short ones, that whatever was going on behind his eyes took its time arriving at his mouth, and that when it did arrive, it was usually worth the wait. His older brother was always going to inherit the property. That was never spoken about as unfair, not by either of them. It was simply how things were done on places like that, the way it had been done for 2 generations before them. And the digger never once, in any letter or any conversation his family later recalled, expressed resentment about it. What he did express, quietly and only a handful of times before he left, was restlessness. A sense that the property's horizon, however much he loved the land itself, was not going to be the whole of his horizon. He wanted to find out, he told his sister once, leaning on a fence post in the last summer before he enlisted, what he was actually made of. Because growing up on a sheep station didn't really test you. It just wore you down slowly enough that you never noticed whether you were strong or simply tired. He enlisted 3 weeks after his 19th birthday. His father drove him to the recruiting office in the nearest large town and didn't say much on the way there or the way back, which everyone in the family understood without needing it explained, as its own kind of blessing. He failed selection the first time in the winter of 1967, and the way he failed it tells you almost everything you need to know about who he was before Vietnam ever entered the picture. Day 4 of the endurance phase. A long descent over loose scree that candidates were not warned about in advance, because selection was built deliberately around the gap between what men expected and what the course actually demanded. His knee, which had taken a bad fall off a horse 2 years earlier and never quite recovered the trust of the surrounding muscle, gave out 3/4 of the way down. He did not call out. He did not ask for help. He sat alone on the scree slope for almost 4 minutes, assessing the way he would later assess far worse things in a Vietnamese jungle, whether the joint would hold his weight again if he stood on it carefully. It would not enough to finish the phase. He stood anyway and walked the remaining distance to the closest checkpoint on a leg that was visibly failing him, not because he believed he could still pass, but because the alternative, being carried off the course on a stretcher, was a version of failure he refused to accept on top of the failure he'd already accepted. The directing staff who watched him do it remembered him. 11 months later, when he returned for his second attempt, one of them recognized him from 50 meters away by the way he walked before he ever got close enough to recognize his face. The second attempt, in 1968, broke other men around him in ways the first attempt hadn't broken him. He watched candidates who had outperformed him physically in every measurable way quit on day 2, day 3, day 6. Not because their bodies failed, but because somewhere in the accumulated exhaustion and sleep deprivation and constant low-grade fear of failing publicly, something in there will simply stopped negotiating with the part of them that wanted to keep going. He did not have that experience. He has been described, by men who went through it alongside him, as someone who seemed to get quieter and more economical with his energy as the course wore on, as though he had already spent his capacity for doubt the first time around and had none left to spend the second. He passed. He was 21 years old, and within a year he would be a corporal commanding his own 4-man patrol team in a province most Australians at home could not have located on a map. The digger was 22 years old when he wrote it. He had grown up on a sheep property 3 hours from the nearest town with a population over 1,000, the second of 4 children, the only one of them who had ever wanted to leave. He had joined the army at 19, not from any particular ideology, not because anyone in his family had a tradition of service stretching back through wars his grandfather wouldn't talk about, but because the property was never going to be his. His older brother had that settled before either of them turned 10, and because something in him wanted to find out what he was capable of before. He found out what he wasn't. He passed selection on his second attempt. The first time, in 1967, he had come apart on day 4 of the endurance phase, not from lack of fitness, but from a knee that gave out on a descent nobody warned you about. And he had walked himself off the course rather than be carried off it, because even at 21, he understood the difference mattered. He came back 11 months later, fitter, harder, quieter than the man who had failed, and this time nothing gave out. Not his knee, not anything else. By October 1969, he had been in Phuoc Thai province for 4 months, attached to a Sabre squadron operating out of Nui Dat. Running patrols into country, the maps described in terms that made the jungle sound smaller and more orderly than it ever was on the ground. He had written home every week without exception. His mother had kept every letter in a biscuit tin that originally held Arnott's shortbread, the kind with the Scottish Terrier on the lid, and by October the tin no longer closed properly. The letters were not dramatic. He did not write about contact, mostly because the army discouraged it, and because he understood, better than men twice his age sometimes understood, that the purpose of a letter home was not to transfer his fear onto people who could do nothing about it. He wrote about heat, about the particular boredom of waiting between operations, about a cook in his company who could make tinned bully beef taste almost acceptable if you gave him enough chili, and about how he'd give anything for his mother's lamb roast, the one with the rosemary from the garden bed near the water tank. He wrote about his men. Not in the formal sense. He was a corporal by then, leading a 4-man patrol team, and the men under him appeared in his letters the way mates appear in any young man's letters, by nickname, by habit, by the small specific details that turn strangers into people you'd die for. There was a Queenslander who couldn't sleep without talking first. 10 minutes of nothing in particular every single night, like a radio that needed to run down before it would switch off. There was a signaller from Tasmania who had taught himself enough Vietnamese to barter properly in the markets near Beria, and who was teaching the rest of the patrol words for things that weren't in any official phrasebook. There was a tracker, an indigenous soldier from Western Australia, whose eye for sign in the jungle the others had stopped questioning within a fortnight of his arrival, because he was right too often for it to be luck. The digger wrote about all of them. He did not, in any letter his mother kept, write the word fear. He came close to it twice, both times in October, both times in language careful enough that you had to read it 3 times to understand what he wasn't quite saying. On the 14th of October, the squadron received intelligence, partial, uncertain. The kind that gets acted on anyway, because waiting for certainty in that war meant waiting forever. That a Viet Cong logistics element was using a creek line 11 kilometers northeast of the base to move supplies toward a staging area further north. The task given to the diggers' patrol was reconnaissance, locate the route, confirm the pattern of movement, report back. Standard work, the kind 4-man SAS teams had done 100 times in that province, without becoming a story anyone outside the regiment would ever hear. They inserted by helicopter at last light on the 15th, the aircraft flaring low over a clearing 2 kilometers from the target area before lifting away into the dark. The same insertion technique every patrol used, the same 30 seconds of exposure every patrol accepted as the price of getting in undetected. The 4 of them moved into thicker cover before the sound of the rotors had fully faded, and from there, they did what SAS patrols did better than almost anyone else in that war. They became quiet. They became patient. They became, for 3 days, almost nothing at all. The first night they moved less than 600 meters, navigating by compass bearing, and the kind of accumulated jungle instinct that no manual could properly teach. Stopping every 50 meters to listen for longer than most soldiers in that war would have had the discipline to wait. The digger insisted on it. He had told his 3 men, more than once in the weeks before, that the patrols who got hurt in this kind of country were not the unlucky ones. They were the ones in a hurry. By the morning of the 17th, they had the creek line under observation from a position the digger had chosen the night before, high enough for sightlines, low enough not to silhouette against the canopy, with 2 separate routes out that didn't cross each other. The signaller logged movement at 6:40, then again at 9:15, then a larger group at 11:40, 11 men with packs consistent with a logistics carry, moving with the unhurried discipline of soldiers who believed this stretch of jungle belonged to them. It did not belong to them, not that morning. 4 Australians, less than 200 meters away, were counting every man, noting every weapon, building a picture that would be radioed back in code within the hour. There was, in the hours before contact, nothing in the patrol's routine to suggest the day would end the way it did. They rotated observation in shifts of 40 minutes, the off-duty pair resting without sleeping, eating cold rations because a heat tablet's flame, however small, was a risk none of them were willing to take this close to an active route. The Queenslander, on his rest rotation, did what he always did before settling, a few quiet words to nobody in particular, a habit the others had stopped finding strange somewhere around his third week in the unit. The tracker spent his break studying the ground itself rather than resting, the way he always did, reading disturbance in the leaf litter the way other men read newspapers. At 11:40, when the larger group crossed, the digger logged it personally, counting twice to be certain, cross-referencing weapon types against silhouettes the way selection, and 4 months in country had trained him to do without conscious thought. 11 men, packs heavy enough to suggest sustained carry rather than a short local movement. A route that, if confirmed over several more days of observation, would tell Australian intelligence something about supply patterns across the whole eastern half of the province. Not just this one creek line. He radioed the count back in code at 12:05. Base acknowledged and instructed the patrol to maintain observation through last light, with extraction to be reassessed the following morning, depending on what further movement the patrol logged. It was, in every respect, a routine instruction for a routine reconnaissance task that had, so far, gone exactly the way it was supposed to. What happened next is recorded in the operational report in language that strips almost everything human out of it, the way operational reports are built to do. A follow-up element, 6 to 8 enemy personnel, possibly a security sweep responding to a separate contact elsewhere in the area, moved unexpectedly along the patrol's secondary withdrawal route at approximately 13:30 hours. Contact was initiated at close range, estimated under 15 meters. The patrol engaged and broke contact according to standing procedure. During the engagement, the patrol commander sustained wounds and was unable to continue movement under his own power. The patrol commander was the digger. The contact itself, pieced together later from the accounts of the 3 men who survived it, lasted somewhere between 90 seconds and 2 minutes, an eternity. In the compressed time of close-quarter jungle fighting, and also nothing at all, over before any of them could properly register it as having started. The enemy element walked into the patrol's secondary route without warning, at a distance close enough that there was no possibility of the careful, controlled, distance-managed engagement the digger had drilled into his men during training. This was not a chosen ambush from a prepared position. This was 4 men and an unknown number of enemy soldiers discovering each other at the same instant, inside the same patch of undergrowth, with no time for anything except reflex. The digger's reflex in that instant was to put himself between the contact and his signaller, who was nearest the point of first fire and who had, at that moment, the radio handset still in his hand from the report he'd sent 20 minutes earlier. It was a decision made in less time than it takes to describe it, the kind of decision that years of training are designed to make automatic. Because a man who has to think about it has already lost the half-second that matters. He was hit twice. The first round struck his upper leg, the kind of wound that is serious but, with fast treatment, survivable. The second struck higher, and it was the second wound that the patrol medic. There was no dedicated medic on this team, so the role fell, as it often did on 4-man patrols, to whichever man had the closest training. In this case, the tracker would later describe to family members as the one that changed everything about what was and wasn't possible in the minutes that followed. What the report does not say, what only survives because the 3 men who carried him spoke about it, decades later. To family members and historians who finally went looking, is that he gave the order to break contact before he gave any indication he had been hit. That the tracker noticed the change in his movement before he said a word about it. That he refused twice to be the reason the extraction was slowed, and that it was the signaler, not the digger, who finally made the decision to override him and call for immediate casualty evacuation regardless of what their patrol commander wanted. The signaler has since described those minutes as the longest of his life, not because of the danger, though the danger was real, with the enemy element still somewhere close, possibly regrouping, possibly pulling back to call up reinforcements of their own, but because of the particular helplessness of watching a man you respect more than almost anyone you've ever served with grow quieter by. The minute while you wait for an aircraft that cannot arrive any faster than physics allows it to. He has said that the digger, even fading, kept asking about the patrol's position relative to the enemy, kept trying to direct the withdrawal, kept being, until he physically could not anymore. The patrol commander, rather than the casualty. The helicopter that came for him arrived 19 minutes later. It was, in the calculus of that war, a fast response. It was not fast enough. He died over Phuoc Thi province, in the air, 3 minutes from the field hospital at Vung Tau, with the Tasmanian signaler's hand pressed against a wound that had already taken more than the young body underneath it had left to give. He was 22 years old. He had been in Vietnam 119 days. The notification reached the family 2 days later, on a Tuesday, in the form it reached every Australian family who lost a son in that war, a telegram. Delivered by a postal worker who had no way of knowing what was inside the envelope he was handing across a kitchen doorway. Words assembled from a standard form that the Army had, by 1969, refined into a kind of grim efficiency. Regret to inform, killed in action, further details to follow. The digger's mother was alone in the house when it arrived. His father was out checking a fence line on the eastern boundary, the kind of ordinary task that fills the hours of a farming life, regardless of what is happening anywhere else in the world. And by the time he came back in for the evening, she had already read the telegram more times than the few words on it should have required, as though rereading it might eventually produce a different set of words. A duty officer came to the house formally 2 days later, on the Thursday, to deliver the news in person and to answer what questions a grieving family could think to ask in the first numb hours of receiving it. He stood in the hallway with his hat in his hands, the way duty officers did in 10,000 hallways across the country during those years, and said the things that needed saying with as much gentleness as the words allowed, which was not very much gentleness at all, because there is no real way to soften an irreducible fact. The funeral was held 9 days later at the small church the family had attended for 3 generations. A building that held perhaps 120 people on a full day, and held considerably more than that on the day they buried him, with neighbors from properties an hour's drive away standing at the back, because the pews had filled an hour before the service began. The Queenslander, the Tasmanian signaler, and the tracker were not present. They were still in Vietnam, still serving out a tour that had 8 more months to run. Learning of their patrol commander's funeral through a letter from the regiment that reached them 3 weeks after the fact, in the same slow, overloaded postal system that would later deliver the digger's own final letter, 18 months behind schedule. He had written the letter 4 nights before the contact, on the 13th of October, by torchlight, in the cramped, careful handwriting his mother could have picked out of 10,000 others. It sat in his pack through the insertion. It sat there through 3 days of observation. It was still folded in the inside pocket of his jacket when the helicopter lifted him out, and it stayed there through the chain of custody that returns a fallen soldier's effects to his unit. and from his unit toward a postal system that was, in October of 1969, processing letters from 500,000 Australians and Americans scattered across a country at war. A system in which a single envelope without a living recipient attached to send it onward could sit in a sorting depot for months without anyone noticing it had stalled. It eventually moved. Mail systems, even broken ones, tend to. By the time it reached the small weatherboard house in regional Victoria, the war the letter described in its present tense had already ended for the family who received it. Ended in the worst and most final way a war can end for a family, 18 months earlier. His mother opened it on a Thursday evening, alone, at the kitchen table, with the radio off and the kettle cold. What follows is not a transcription. That document belongs to the family who still holds it, and that is exactly where it should stay, but its substance. The things in it that the family has spoken about publicly in the decades since. The things that turned 1,100 words into the single object that the family has said, again and again, did more for their grief than any medal, any ceremony, any official letter from a department ever managed to do. He wrote about the heat, as he always did. He wrote about a card game 2 nights earlier that the Queenslander had lost so comprehensively that he'd had to do the washing up rota for a week, and about how good it felt to laugh at something stupid in a place that didn't give you much reason to. He wrote briefly about missing the smell of the property after rain, a smell he said he hadn't properly noticed until he was somewhere that didn't have it. And near the end, in the 2 paragraphs his mother would later say she had read more times than she could count, he wrote something close to an apology and something close to a promise at the same time. He told her that if anything happened to him over there, she was not to spend the rest of her life sad about it, because he had chosen this with his eyes open. And he did not regret the choice, even on the days that were hard. He told her the men he served with were the best people he had ever met, and that whatever happened to him, it would not have happened to him alone, that he was never, not for 1 minute of that war, facing it by himself. He signed it the way he signed every letter, not his rank, not his surname, just the name his mother had given him 22 years earlier, the one that had nothing to do with the army at all. The digger's letter was not, as the family would learn many years later when they began speaking with historians and other veteran families, an isolated case. Records held by the Australian War Memorial and recovered through repatriation files from the era show that letters from Vietnam, particularly those written by SAS personnel on operations where mail collection depended on irregular resupply runs rather than fixed daily routes, could take anywhere from 6 weeks to, in rare and devastating cases like this one, well over a year to reach their intended recipients. The reasons were mundane in the way that the worst bureaucratic failures usually are. A 4-man patrol operating from a forward base did not have daily mail pickup. Letters accumulated in a soldier's kit until a resupply helicopter or a return to Nui Dat gave an opportunity to hand them over. And from there, they entered a chain that moved them first to a unit postal point, then to a central military post office in Saigon, then onto whatever air or sea transport had capacity, then into the Australian domestic postal system, which was itself handling unprecedented volumes of correspondence to and from a war zone on the other side of the world. At any one of those 6 or 7 handoffs, a piece of mail belonging to a soldier who had since been killed could simply stall, not lost, not destroyed, just slowed by a system with no mechanism for recognizing that the letter it was carrying had become, without anyone intending it, the most important document a particular family would ever receive. Other families have come forward with similar stories in the decades since, though never in large numbers, because most never spoke about it publicly at all. A wife in Queensland who received a letter from her husband 11 months after his memorial service describing, in detail, plans for the house they were going to build when he came home. A father in regional New South Wales who kept, until his own death in the 1990s, an unopened letter from his son that he could never bring himself to read. The only piece of unread mail in a house that otherwise threw nothing away. These stories rarely made it into official histories. They lived instead in biscuit tins and bottom drawers, and the kind of family memory that gets passed down in fragments, mentioned once at a funeral, never quite turned into the full story it deserved to be. What makes the digger's letter unusual is not the delay itself, but the fact that his family eventually chose, carefully and on their own terms, to let parts of it become public, not as content to be read aloud, which they have never permitted, but as a story to be told because his sister came to believe, after decades of treating it as a private wound, that other families carrying similar letters in similar tins might find something useful in knowing they were not alone in that particular specific grief. For years, the family did not know what to do with it. A letter that arrives after a death occupies a strange place in grief. It is not closure, because closure implies an ending, and the letter is not an ending. It is the opposite. It is a voice arriving from before the ending, a voice that does not yet know what the reader already knows, a voice still mid-sentence about a future it would never reach. His mother read it perhaps 1,000 times over the following decades. She did not need to take it out of the tin to know what it said. She took it out anyway every year on the 17th of October and read it again at the kitchen table where she had first opened it. She died in 2003. The letter passed to the digger's younger sister, who, in the years since, has spoken about it twice publicly, once at a regimental memorial service, once at the unveiling of a small commemorative plaque in the town nearest the family property, and both times she has made the same point, in slightly different words. And it is worth repeating here, because it is the only conclusion this story really needs. She has said that for a long time she resented the letter, not the words in it, the timing. The cruelty of a system that let a young man's voice keep traveling for a year and a half after his life had stopped, arriving in her mother's hands like a door that had already been closed reopening, just enough to remind you of everything on the other side of it. She has said it took her until well into her own middle age to understand that the letter's lateness was not a cruelty at all, that a voice arriving after loss, however painful, is not the same as a voice lost completely, that her brother had, without knowing it, without any way of knowing it, given his mother 1,100 more words of him than the war had any obligation to leave behind. The regiment does not release casualty details by name without family consent. And this family, like a great many SAS families across the decades, has chosen privacy over recognition for the man at the center of this story. What they have allowed into the public record is the shape of it, the letter, the timing, the substance of what their son and brother wrote in his final days, and the broader truth that his story is not unique. It is one of dozens, possibly hundreds, letters arriving after telegrams, voices outliving by weeks or months the men who wrote them. A postal system built for a country and a war that moved faster than the mail ever could, leaving behind these strange, suspended documents, not obituaries, not eulogies, just ordinary letters from an ordinary young man to his mother, rendered extraordinary by nothing except the date stamped on the envelope. The Queenslander, the Tasmanian signaller, and the tracker from Western Australia all came home from that tour. None of them, in the years that followed, spoke easily about the 17th of October. What is known is pieced together from regimental oral histories recorded decades later, from veterans' reunions, from the kind of conversations old soldiers have with each other in tones nobody else in the room is meant to hear. The signaller, the one who overrode his patrol commander's order and called for evacuation against his explicit wishes, carried that decision for the rest of his life, not as guilt. Family members have said, but as the single moment he was most certain he had done the right thing, even though it changed nothing about the outcome. He attended the unveiling of the commemorative plaque in 1998, an old man by then, and reportedly said only a handful of words to the gathered crowd. That he had served with the finest soldier he ever met. That every patrol he ran after that one, for the rest of his career, he ran a little more carefully, because he understood now exactly what carelessness cost. He stayed in the Army for another 14 years after Vietnam, eventually training signalers of his own. And those who served under him in the 1970s and 1980s have said he had one rule that he repeated more often than any other, delivered without explanation to men who had no idea where it came from. Know exactly where your mate is before you need to know it. None of them understood, until much later, that the rule had been paid for on a creek line in Phuoc Thi province by a patrol commander who had not had 19 minutes to spare. The tracker returned to Western Australia and rarely discussed the war at all, in the manner of a great many indigenous veterans of that era whose service went, for decades, without the recognition it was owed. Those who knew him said he kept a single photograph from his Vietnam service in his wallet for the rest of his life, not a photograph of combat, not of the regiment, but of 4 young men sitting on ammunition crates outside their tent at Nui Dat, laughing at something none of them ever explained to anyone who asked. He worked, after his discharge, as a stockman and later as a heritage advisor on land management projects across the Kimberley. And colleagues who worked alongside him for years have said it was sometimes months before they learned, almost by accident, that he had served in the SAS at all. He did not volunteer it. When asked directly, late in his life, why he carried that particular photograph rather than any other, he reportedly said only that it was the last picture taken of all 4 of them together. And that some things you keep not because they're easy to look at, but because forgetting them would be worse. The Queenslander became, in later life, one of the people who helped push for better record-keeping around SAS casualties of that war, not for recognition. He said in one of the few interviews he gave, but because families deserved better than telegrams and silence. He never used the digger's name in those interviews. He only ever called him, with a kind of formality that had nothing to do with rank, his mate. In that same interview, conducted for a regimental history project in the early 2000s, he was asked what he remembered most clearly about the man he had served under for 4 months in 1969. He said it was not the contact, and not the helicopter, and not even the funeral he could not attend. It was a small thing. From weeks before any of that, a night at Nui Dat when the power to their section of the base had failed, and the digger had spent 2 hours by torchlight helping him rewrite a letter to a girl back home that he'd been too embarrassed to send as originally written. Line by line, patient and exact, because he said a letter you only get to send once was worth getting right. That same patience, the Queenslander said, was in every letter the digger ever sent his own mother. He had simply never once, in 4 months of serving beside him, imagined it would end up mattering quite this much. There is a temptation, in telling stories like this one, to make the dead into something larger than they were, to render a 22-year-old corporal from a Victorian sheep property into a symbol, so polished it no longer resembles a person. That is not what this story is for. The digger was not a symbol. He was a young man who failed selection once and came back, who missed his mother's lamb roast more than he ever let himself admit in writing, who laughed at a card game 2 nights before he died, and thought it was worth mentioning in what turned out to be the last letter he would ever send. Who once spent 2 hours of his own sleep helping a mate get a letter right, because he believed, long before he had any reason to know how true it would become for him personally. That word sent into the world without a chance to be taken back deserved to be sent with care. What makes his story worth telling is not that he was extraordinary in some mythic sense. It is that he was, by every account that survives him, an entirely ordinary young Australian who did an extraordinarily difficult thing, who went at 19 and again at 21, looking for the hardest test his country could offer him, who passed it, and who then spent 4 months in a jungle on the other side of the world writing letters home that thought more about his mother's worry than his own danger. The letter that arrived 18 months late is not a tragedy on top of a tragedy. It is, in the only way that mattered to the people who loved him, the opposite. It is a young man's voice, ordinary and warm and a little homesick, refusing by simple accident of a broken postal system to let the telegram have the last word. Phuoc Thi Province, South Vietnam. The 17th of October, 1969. A 4-man patrol broke contact in dense jungle, 11 kilometers from a base most Australians have never heard of, in a war most of them have stopped thinking about. One of those 4 men did not make it home, but somewhere in a postal sack, moving slower than the war around it, a letter he had written 4 days earlier kept traveling, patient, ordinary, unaware of everything that had already happened, until 18 months later it finally arrived and gave a grieving mother 1,100 more words of her son than anyone had any right to expect. It still sits today in a biscuit tin that no longer closes properly. It is read still every October. Some letters never stop arriving.